Inter Milan won, Arsenal 0 in what was actually a very dominant performance from Arsenal. Obviously, they did lose 1-0, but I actually think Arsenal were very good, but then so were Inter Milan. Defensively, they were outstanding, and tactically, this was a really interesting match. It was almost like a chess match in a few moments. But we will have a look at the tactics in a minute. Inter Milan's defensive structure is insane. I'm going to put that out there now. They are arguably the best defensive team in Europe right now. I'd make an argument for that. They've kept 4 clean sheets in their last 4 Champions League games, which is ridiculous when you consider the teams that they're facing. Their defensive solidity is almost unbreakable. They were exceptional today. And we're going to take a look at a few different tactical instructions that both teams used to try and get the upper hand. And debatably, Arsenal should have won this game, or at least should have got something out of this game. I do think they were very strong. But as soon as Inter Milan had a goal to hold on to, they just sat back and they invited pressure and knew that they'd be able to see the game out. And they didn't really do anything too much differently compared to what we would expect. They set up in their 5-3-2 formation, but they attack actually in more of a 3-5-2 or arguably a 3-2-5. And they do it slightly interestingly. It might not be what you expect. And Arsenal set up in a 4-4-2 defensive structure. So it looks something a bit like this. So, if we push the players up a little bit, we'll get everyone into position. So, as I said, Arsenal defend in a 4-4-2. They almost pressed in this formation as well. But going forward, or at least maybe building out a little bit, is you would see an attacking 5 like this. And I know what you're thinking. Surely not. Surely this is not possible. Well, it happened. You best believe me. It was something a bit more like this. So, here we go. 3, 2, 5. And you could, we'll discuss Marino in a minute actually. But interestingly, and I don't know if you noticed while I was setting that up, the left attacking half space player is Bisek. I'm probably pronouncing his name wrong. What they do is Calhanoglu will drop deep. Now he will come forward again eventually, so it almost transitions into a 2-3-5 instead. But in the first phase, he will drop a little bit deeper so that either Bisek can come wide and then Darmian will tuck into this position, or if Darmian is holding the width, Bisek will attack this side of the pitch. And it's really interesting because he is a right-footed centre-back. Now, Arsenal's press, we know how they normally press in their 4-4-2. It was quite interesting. Sometimes you'd see Marino try and jump onto Calhanoglu when he dropped deep, so he was almost tracking him in all situations. Fratesi came a bit wider. It varied a lot because the main aspect of this game is the idea of fluidity, and Inter Milan have perfected fluidity. Inzaghi has got them playing the most ridiculous fluid style of football you will ever see. A centre-back is playing in the 8th position. It means that they fill that centre-back position by splitting the centre-backs and dropping a CDM back in there who then will ball carry forward. You could sometimes see Bisek on the left wing. Darmian inverts a little bit. We saw a lot of different rotations. And I actually want to show you Bisek's heat map from this game. You can see where he had all of his touches, or the majority of them. Now, a lot of them obviously were in the defensive zones. Makes sense because second half, Arsenal had all of the ball. But going forward, you can see Bisek got a lot of touches in a very advanced positions, which is bizarre. In terms of the stats, he was also very good. He won 6 out of 7 ground duels. He was also the most fouled person in the entire match. And he made 14 defensive actions, which again was the most in the match, which included 3 block shots as well. And one of which was from a very, very impressive block against Kai Havertz in the 74th minute, where Havertz kind of found a bit of space. We'll cover it a little bit more in a little bit later in this video, but Havertz found a little bit of space, took the shot, maybe 6-7 yards out, maybe 10 yards out, no more than that, and Bisek came flying in to make a wonderful block, and I think he had an unreal game. So for me, already putting this out there, my man of the match. I thought he was bloody brilliant, considering that Bastoni normally does this role. Bisek did it incredibly. It's ridiculous how they're so willing to put centre-backs forward. But yes, Arsenal defended in a 4-4-2 fashion. Again, as I said, it varied a little bit, depending on... It was more of a ball side man-to-man press. I'll explain what I mean by that. As I said in the first transitional phase, Inter Milan would sometimes build out in more of a 3-5-2 rather than a 3-2-5 or eventually a 2-3-5. Again, it varied, but Arsenal pressed in a 4-4-2, and you can see that here. But interestingly, Trossard would always apply pressure to Bissek. Say the ball comes out this way. Havertz would then apply pressure to Vri, Martinelli to Pavard, Timber would step out. Calhanoglu would always be tracked because, as we said, he liked to drop a lot deeper. Marino would follow him. So even when Calhanoglu came into these positions, so Bissek could come wide, Saka would then track Darmian, Partey would step up. And as you can see in this position, it's Fratesi that's got the space, so he was quite often the spare man in the midfield zones, but also just by having 3 in the midfield versus Arsenal's 2, it did mean that they were quite consistently getting overloads in them areas to then play through. Primarily in the first 20 minutes, Inter Milan looked dominant, and they really did look like they were able to play through the lines pretty progressively, effectively, fluidly, a lot of rotations in their squad as well. So as soon as one position was left vacated, someone else would step in, and quite often Fratesi was on this, even though he didn't have many touches, he was the spare man. But again, maybe then you saw Martinelli come deeper, or Timber would invert, Gabriel came across, and it became something a bit more like this. So again, it varied, but Arsenal's press was actually pretty, I don't want to say it was poor in the first 20-30 minutes, but they didn't do it as well as maybe we have seen them do before. But Inter actually managed to create a lot of chances in these first 20 minutes as well. I mean, 2 minutes in, we saw them really trying to stretch that Arsenal backline. Arsenal obviously play with a backline of 4. You were seeing quite often Martinelli or Saka would drop deeper to almost make it a back 5 in a wing-back position. But when they didn't, it was a back 4 against Inter Milan's attacking 5. And we saw within 2 minutes of the game, Dumfries had a load of space. Actually, I can get it up here. We've got Dumfries out here on the right-hand side, and he's in acres of space. We can see already there's 5 attackers from Inter Milan against the 4 recovering players of Arsenal, if you will. You've got 1, 2, 3, 4. So already Inter Milan have got an overload in the attacking zone. And as I said, Dumfries has got all this space to run into. And Timber should be checking his shoulder here. I'm not saying he should come all the way across to cover this run, but he should be checking his shoulder to know Dumfries is there. The cross comes in, and it does come to Dumfries, as expected. Arsenal do recover pretty well. They get a back 5 back into shape, so they are less outnumbered, obviously. But Dumfries, brilliant wing back, gets up and down. He's definitely got an ability to shoot from these kind of positions, and he does, and it hits the post in the end. He used the outside of his foot, curled it. Really nice shot, and actually, if that was a goal, I think that would have been a very well-deserved and a nice goal. Again, this comes from Inter Milan committing their players forward and the attacking 5 versus the defensive 4, and Inter Milan stretching them out and using the space where it becomes available. And we saw that from Dumfries in this situation. Now, second half was a little bit different. Arsenal began to dominate a little bit more. Obviously, they've now gone 1-0 down to the penalty just before half-time. We'll discuss that a little bit later as well. Arsenal became a little bit more positionally aware. I'm going to go with that phrase, positionally aware of where they should be. Now, Inter Milan were happy to just sit back. They defended in their 5-3-2 formation, again, as we expected. The main thing that happened was a halftime change of Marino coming off and Jesus coming on, and it meant Havertz was the one dropping a little bit deeper. And why I think this was really critical is in the first half when you had Marino on, when you had it like this, quite often you would see positions where it would look something a little bit like this. Arsenal were not always getting 5 attacking lines, and actually if I drop it back into the 5 back as well for Inter Milan, here we go, something a bit like this. You can see down this channel here, you ideally want an Arsenal player attacking, and in the first half, occasionally Marino would be the one to push forward, but especially when Havertz was dropping into these positions, say Saka's got the ball, and we saw something like this where Trossard and Havertz would come very close to the ball, trying to create little overloads in their zones, which is fine, but you need then players that can make these runs to fill the gaps pretty much. You've got space there to attack, and Arsenal weren't attacking it very well. And that's what they needed to change in the second half, and they did it pretty well. So by getting Jesus on instead, it meant Havertz could stay more in this channel over here, Jesus up front, and Trossard almost pinned between the lines as well, alongside Havertz as the two number 8s or number 10s, whatever you want to call them. And it then meant that they could go a bit more man for man against the back 5 of Inter Milan, and that's what they needed to do. Creates a little bit more restriction in how Inter Milan can set up, and especially then in these situations, if you get a midfield runner breaking in between the lines, Saka's more than capable of putting a cross in there. Say Timber's made a run from deep in between these, in between the lines. So it's possible, and I think this was the main thing that Arsenal needed to work on in the second half, and they did it pretty well. What I found really interesting is Bissek pretty much just man-marked Trossard the entire game. If we go to this next clip here, you can see you've got the defensive line of Inter Milan here, but actually this is the defensive line, which is kind of fine because you've still got a defensive 4 shape, but we can see as we zoom in here, Bissek steps way out into almost a position where you'd expect this to be Zielinski's job or someone like that to come across instead, and Bissek should stay in this position here. And the main reason for that is then you do get all this space that the likes of Havertz can run into, and that was one issue that I thought Arsenal were going to try and exploit. They didn't do it all the time, but they did do it quite consistently, and Havertz actually got a really good chance from this moment as well, where he did make this run into this gap, and it was effective. So we did see there were some defensive frailties in the Inter Milan setup. Again though, Arsenal dominated the ball in all sorts of areas. Going back to the defensive setup from Inter Milan though, as we can see in this situation, the main space for Arsenal to attack is in these areas of the pitch. Inter Milan, with their midfield 3, are really good at forcing their opponents wide into this zone and this zone. So you either got Martinelli dropping a little bit deeper to get onto the ball, or Timber into this position, Zinchenko when he came on. Ben White would quite often attack into this situation in this kind of shape. And it meant that Arsenal were limited to how they could then create. With Trossard pinned between the lines, Bissek would step up. You did sometimes get the option to play a ball in between the lines here, but Inter Milan are so disciplined, Darmian would just drop deeper, or Bissek would know when not to press Trossard and Zielinski would come across, or we saw different variations where they made sure that there was no gaps in their defensive line, or they tried to make sure there was no gaps in their defensive line. So it meant Arsenal were left to crossing more often than not. Saka on this right hand side, Martinelli on the left, Timber on the left as well. They put a lot of crosses into the box. In fact, they attempted 46 crosses. They only completed 10 of them. I think that's some ridiculous number for a game like this. The fact that they were able to get so many crosses into the box and try and create some real threat that way. Inter Milan were happy with this because they've got De Vrij, Bissek and Pavard at the back, who are obviously going to, or almost definitely going to dominate that box against Havertz and Jesus. So that for Inter Milan was the game plan. Force Arsenal wide, force them to having to cross the ball into the box, and then they would be able to clean up in their own aerial space in just outside the goal. Sommer was very good at coming out and claiming crosses, or De Vrij was very good at getting his head to the first cross that came in. Towards the end of the second half though, Arsenal did start becoming a little bit more attacking. Obviously they wanted the goal. Again, if we keep it in this 3-2-5 shape, they actually started progressing more into a 2-2-6 shape. So Timber would maybe invert and White would attack forward as well, and we'd see something a bit more like this. Partey a little bit more reserved. I thought Partey had a really good game today, by the way. But we saw something almost like this. And I think Inter Milan were worried that this was actually going to start causing them a lot of threat. So, obviously we saw changes again. So the main changes that we saw, Fratesi came off for Barrea. I'm surprised Barrea didn't start. And actually, I think Martinez was off the pitch at the moment. But Taremi came off and DeMarco came on. It was actually Thuram up top. I've not got him on this setup at the moment. And they went into a 5-4-1. And this meant then when White was underlapping, overlapping down the right hand side, or similarly, sometimes Timber would be doing it this side in this shape instead. You can see a 2-2-6. Timber would try and get advanced, or Ben White would try and get advanced to create overloads in the wide areas. Now that they know that they're being forced wide, let's try and get to... I think Arteta was thinking if they can get Saka and Ben White up against Darmian, they can then beat their man a lot easier, and that will create a lot more overloads. So this is how Inter Milan decided to react. They went into a 5-4-1. So it meant DeMarco could track the run of the overlapping fullbacks, or Barrea could track the run of the overlapping fullback, so that they still maintained, so that Arsenal didn't have a numerical advantage. They made it a lot harder for Arsenal to beat their man, and when they did, there was then the next Inter Milan player already there that they'd then have to face as well. And I thought that was a really tactical and interesting, good move from Inzaghi in that situation. Ultimately, I think the main thing that didn't cost Arsenal, but Arsenal really missed, with Havertz and Trossard being the two number 10s pinned in between the lines, they lacked that creative player that could unlock a very deep block into Milan. You need the likes of Odegaard, or maybe even a Declan Rice would be able to do it. And Nwaneri, I'm probably saying his name wrong, showed promising signs when he came on. I don't think he would have been capable of starting this game. It was probably too much for him, but he did show some good glimpses when he came on. You need someone like that that's just capable of playing that through ball that splits a couple of the defenders for the likes of Trossard to run onto. Or you need someone that's going to be able to play a lofted ball over the top of the defenders into a run of Havertz. Odegaard is the kind of person that can do that, and arguably Declan Rice can do that as well. Both were missing from this game. Obviously, Odegaard did come on towards the end, but it wasn't enough time for him to actually find any creative moments. This is the real example of when you need a playmaker to unlock a very tight defence. Jorginho arguably could have done it as well. So that's what I think Arsenal were lacking. But they did still have some good chances. And I'm going to go back to this moment here. This is the Bissek block that I mentioned earlier. We're now talking about Arsenal having an attacking 5 in each zone. We can see here now that they have. So you've got one over here. He's in the lines here. Havertz, Trossard and Saka. So you've got an attacking 5 now in a line, in an attacking line pretty much. But what's noticeable is Havertz is finding space between the Inter Milan centre-backs. He's not pinning one of them. He's not primarily attaching himself to Bissek or to De Vrij or whatever. He's finding little gaps in between that he can then try and get a moment. And he does in this situation. The ball comes in and it falls to him in this gap here. He takes a pretty decent touch, and you'd maybe expect him to score. But as I said earlier, Bissek comes flying in and he made a very important block. It went out for a corner and nothing came of it. This is why Bissek was my man of the match, but also this is the kind of moments that I think Arsenal were relying on to try and score their goal. And they did dominate. They were really dominant. I think if Inter Milan weren't 1-0 up, they would have the whole game would have been very different. But the fact that Inter Milan had a lead, it meant that because they're so confident with their defensive abilities, that they were happy to sit back and invite pressure. And this reflected in the stats. In the second half alone, Arsenal ranked up 1.21 XG compared to Inter Milan's 0.05. So Arsenal were expected to score at least one goal in that second half. Obviously, it's all data, but given the chances that they had, you would have expected them to at least score one goal. They had 71% possession as well in the second half, as well as 13 attempts, including 2 big chances. So they had the opportunities. But I also want to show you this graph here as well. And this graph shows the field tilt of the game. So what I mean by that is it shows the volume of final third touches over a 10-minute moving average. So basically, I'm saying Arsenal were very dominant in sustaining their attacks and very advanced, so in their attacking third. I think this was due to them having more positional rigidity. By having each of them attacking 5 lanes filled, it meant that they were able to sustain their attacks a bit better. And I also think the fact that Inter Milan were happy to sit a bit deeper also invited Arsenal forward. So you could say it's a combination of the two, but it goes to show that Arsenal technically, based on the field tilt alone, were dominant. The possession and the attempts on goal as well as the XG, shows that Arsenal were just on top, and they arguably deserved to get something from this game. And the final stat I want to throw at you is they made 79% of all their final third phase passes. This again shows how attacking they were. They made 166 out of a possible 209 passes in their attacking third. The amount of touches in the box were insane. Inter Milan were just so disciplined. None of them stepped in to make any rash tackles. They know where they're meant to be. As soon as one of their players steps out of their position, it's filled by someone else and they all move across. And it's just a ridiculous setup that they've got. And ultimately they were undone. Arsenal were undone by a penalty. And was it a penalty? Yes, I think I've actually got the photo here. Yeah, here we go. Was it a penalty? I'm going to say yes, and I know that's going to get a lot of criticisms. I'm going to say it was a penalty, but only on the basis that the one on the night before in the Sporting Lisbon game against Manchester City was also given as a penalty. I don't think it was. In the Premier League, this definitely wouldn't have been given, but we know in the Champions League the rules are if it touches a hand, then it's a penalty, regardless of the close proximity. I mean, here you can see it's Mourinho's hand that it hits here. Taremi's foot, by the way, is here. So, or nearly. This is his foot here. So he's kicked it onto Mourinho's hand. They are so close that it shouldn't technically be a penalty, but the way that the rules are in the Champions League, it is a penalty. And obviously Calhanoglu sticks it away, as you'd expect. I think he scored all 19 of penalties he's taken at Inter Milan or something ridiculous like that. And it ultimately meant Arsenal had to fight to get a goal back, and they did it really well. Arteta was a bit unfortunate, I think. And I'm scared, as a Chelsea fan, I'm scared to face them on Sunday. With Odegaard potentially being fit and Palmer potentially being out, I don't see any way that Arsenal don't win that game. And I think if they keep doing what they did against Inter Milan, they will be fine. Regardless of their recent losses against Newcastle and now Inter Milan, I don't think that's a problem. Arteta is showing such good managerial prowess. His knowledge, his half-time changes really changed the game as well. So ultimately, I think Arsenal deserves to get something out of that, which pains me to say, but I am glad that Inter Milan won, and I do think Inter Milan were also tactically brilliant. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. Let me know what you guys think. Did Arsenal deserve to win, and should Arsenal have had a penalty as well for that Mourinho head punch, we're going to call it? Probably yes, they should have as well. So anyway, yeah, I love a Champions League night. Very exciting. And if you want to see a different video where I analyse a Champions League match, go and check out this video here. I talk about how Rafinha is simply one of the best players in Europe right now. He is ridiculous. And he proved it again last night as well for me. So thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all very soon with a brand new video.